Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman, and this is the channel where we discuss all things related to education today, or any day, actually. We do talk about history too. Today, we have an important show about mathematics. If you are somebody who would like to drive over bridges and not have them fall down underneath you, or not have planes fall out of the sky, you don't have to be a math teacher, or math student, or even a parent to be interested in math and the future of mathematics education in America. That's my opinion. Your mileage may vary, but we're going to talk about that today. In particular, what's going on in math education in California. But I want to warn you, wherever you are, in America especially, but really anywhere, California has some pretty important universities that educate people from all over the world. What goes on in California education does impact you. So I would encourage everybody watching this to pay close attention and get involved, even if it's not your state, because we don't want the ideas that we're going to be talking about today to take hold and spread all over the country. What am I talking about? Well, first, let me introduce my guest, and then we can get into that. So my guest today, help me with your last name. It's David Margulies. Is that right? Margulies.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I should have asked that in advance. David Margulies, and he is coming to us as much as a parent, as a member of the STEM profession. He graduated from UC San Diego with a PhD in materials science out of the Center for Magnetic Recording Research. I don't even know what that is. Maybe you can explain it to us. He worked as a research staff member at IBM Research, and he's co-authored numerous scientific publications, including first author of papers in physical review letters, physical review, and applied physics letters. He's the co-author of 34 United States patents, including one that covered the magnetic recording media used in the first iPod made. He will, so he's going to explain to us his perspective on what is known as the Draft California Math Framework. Now, what is that? I'm going to give it to you high level because I'm not an expert, but I have been involved in trying to help raise awareness as to the problems that a lot of us see with it. California Board of Education, every so many years, maybe you can tell me how many years apart they do this. They do it
7.
Every 7 years.
Yes.
Okay. They adopt a new framework for teaching math in K-12. And that also then will align with the UC system in terms of, feeding into their math and STEM programs. And it is not necessarily required that school districts adopt the adopted framework. They can reject it and teach a different way. But let's just say most do, because why wouldn't they? I mean, the Board of Education has adopted it, said this is how we recommend that you teach math for all the students in California. And there tends to be a lot of pressure to conform to that. It's sort of a technicality that it's not required or optional. Most optional things end up being used by default because it has a lot of legitimacy that the Board of Education has approved it. So the current draft math framework, it has gotten a lot of pushback, in particular from STEM professionals, because it, as you can imagine, with a lot of other things going on in education right now, is highly politicized in parts of it. It also takes more of an inquiry or student-led approach as opposed to direct instruction, and changes the pathways that students might take towards math, through high school and then on into college. That, I think, is the area you're going to talk to us about today, right, David? Those pathways?
Yes, one area in particular for sure, yes.
Okay, so I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to turn it over to David, who, compared to me, is the expert in this matter. And I've asked him to come and talk to us because I'm really concerned about what's happening to math education all over the country, but in particular in California. California, as I say all the time on this channel, is like a country within our country. It's huge, and it has enormous influence on the rest of the country. So please pay attention. And at the end of this broadcast, we're going to give you a link that we hope you'll use to go make public comment. There is a limited amount of time. We're running out of time. The 16th is the last day to make public comment rejecting this. And we hope no matter where you are in the country, you will do so. All right, David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Deb. Well, first, it's an honor to be on your show. And I'm sure I speak for a lot of people in thanking you for the tireless work that you do for helping with understanding education.
Well,
so, okay. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, put the slideshow on.
All right. We do have a presentation for everybody that
yes.
David has put together for us. Okay.
All right. So we're going to go through. We're going to look at the issues with this math framework that's being discussed, and it's in the second field review right now. And so basically, first of all, what are frameworks? Well, so according to the Department of Education, curriculum frameworks provide guidance to educators, parents, and publishers to support implementing the California content standards. So school boards and school districts look to the framework for guidance in determining course offerings. Offices of education look to the framework for guidance in teacher education and textbook selection. Textbook publishers look to the framework for guidance in what they do with their content. And so this framework does matter.
Mm-hmm. That sounds a lot like why the rest of us should pay attention to, because textbook writers aren't going to want to make a textbook that wouldn't be usable in California because it's such a giant market.
Yes, that's a very good point. Okay, so there's certain things here that the framework's doing that I'm going to address in this talk. And so one is it's going to guide for a one-size-fits-all approach to math classes and students until 11th grade. So that means that students are placed in the same class until then, regardless of their preparation, motivation, and ability. And so the way this is phrased in the framework, so here's a quote: "This framework recommends that all students take the same rich mathematics courses in kindergarten through grade 8. For high school courses, pathways for high school coursework reflecting a common 9th and 10th grade experience." And so what this ends up meaning is students who need more support are grouped with students who are ready to advance, along with all students in between. So it's one size fits all to math until 11th grade. And then a consequence of this is that the taking of Algebra 1 is going to be delayed until 9th grade, and a lot of students take it in 8th grade and earlier.
My kids did.
Yes, no, it's certainly a large. I think they actually 25% of the kids in the United States take algebra in 8th grade. So it affects a lot. This would affect a lot of kids. And then so it adds a new course called the MIC3 we'll discuss. The framework guides to removing standards-based instruction. And then a big problem with this framework is that it seriously misrepresents the citations that it quotes from.
Okay. Now, as far as standards-based instruction, I know there are some people who sort of poo-poo standards, and they said like, oh, that's so rigid and everything. But do you agree with me that we need in a public system, we need to have some minimum basic standards? Otherwise, we don't really know. We can't be sure we're giving all the kids at least the minimum same thing, equality of access to a certain minimum level of math.
Yes, I mean that is exactly what people are very concerned about, who are especially educators and teachers, because you go from one district to the next, and if kids just aren't learning the mathematic content, then they will just not be prepared to go on. And so certainly there is, I guess, this issue with too many standards versus, but in comparison to not enough. But the place to address that is the standards. So not a framework just all of a sudden deciding to not teach to them. Then if you think there are too many standards, then address those standards and reduce a few, and then motivate why you say it's fair to reduce them or why they should be reduced. But the framework is not a place to go ahead and start doing that, and that's why people are very concerned.
Got it.
Okay. So here, yes. So as Deb alluded to, public comment period is still open for this framework. So anyone listening, we highly recommend that you can go and do this. You can go to savemath.net in order to readily one click and make these comments, and as well as read more about the framework. You can also go to the Department of Education site, which is listed there. And as Deb said, what happens in California can go across the country. So the whole country is has a vested interest in this problem. Now, there are several other very important sites that I want to make sure people are aware of right at the outset. And the first of them is a public comment on the framework by Brian Conrad, professor of mathematics, director of undergraduate studies in math at Stanford. So he did a very detailed analysis of the framework and wrote up an extensive public comment that he made, that he submitted, as well as made publicly available. And it's very, very important for people to really read what his reaction to this is. And one of the points that he brings up is how it's misrepresenting the literature that it's using to justify itself, which, I mean, obviously is a huge concern for a document of public policy.
How are
So
they
next,
getting away? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I, I've seen that before. I've seen that, on Twitter, for example, people commenting on how it's been misrepresented. Multiple people in the world of math in California and educators in the universities and so forth. And how are they getting away with that? Shouldn't that be disqualifying right out of the gate?
you would certainly think so, and I think a large amount of people who actually take the time to really read this document are really shocked at what is happening and how that is happening and who is enabling this. It's a huge concern. And in Brian Conrad's comments, he says, this cannot happen again. However, whatever allowed this to happen, it just should not be happening, and it can never happen again. It is yeah, for a document of public policy to not be based on evidence-based research is truly disconcerting.
Right.
Okay, and so yeah, so there's an open letter that's signed by 1,700 STEM professionals, and it's still growing, the signers. There's also a letter on data science in the high school math curriculum signed by academic staff at the four-year universities, and one of the quotes from it: students who take a data science course as an alternative to Algebra 2 in high school will be substantially unprepared for any STEM major in college. And the reason this is important, because this is what the draft framework is pushing. Okay, so to go on just qualitatively what schools do now in terms of math as a function, math courses as a function of grade, it's shown schematically here. So basically the top course pathway is how students get to AP Calculus. So they start with Algebra 1 in 8th grade, Geometry 9th, Algebra 2 10th, Pre-Calculus 11th, and then they get to AP Calculus. And then there's a second course pathway. It's called the Integrated Math 1, 2, 3 courses. And these are essentially a rearrangement of the content of the Algebra Geo Algebra course pathways. So they cover the same content, just in a different order. So they're really essentially the first order, the same pathways.
Right. Can I comment on one thing? Some people might see this and think, oh, well, I don't think my child is not interested in AP calculus or whatever, so big whoop, right? But I can tell you again, because two of my three children, one is just finishing 8th grade, did Algebra 1 in 8th grade. And my eldest daughter, who's graduating this year and going on to college, she took pre-calc last year. And she decided at that time, okay, I think I'm done with math. However, it mattered that she had taken pre-calc as far as her college admission because she wants to go into a STEM field. She's doing psychology, but she wants to go into the natural sciences side of psychology. And there's a lot of, math involved and research and so forth. And they looked at that favorably. That was important on her college application, that she'd already gone to that level of math. So now she does not have to take that. She doesn't have to take that math. She can go right into probability and statistics in college instead, because she's already at that level. And I think that's something people forget about is, pre-calc doesn't necessarily mean you're going into becoming an engineer or whatever. It just can be something the colleges look at as a differentiator between you and somebody else.
Yes, and absolutely. And I think that one of the concerns here is also just, kids in 8th grade, they don't necessarily know what they're going to do when they get to
No
college.
idea.
And that's why it's important to leave these doors open. And so that's a big thing behind these pathways. Okay, so then qualitatively, what the framework is doing is shown below. So they have a common experience for all students for 9th and 10th grade, and all students in the same classes in middle school. So what this means is students start with Algebra 1 and 9th, and then, so then what do they end up with when they hit 12th grade? Because if they wanted calculus is a 5-year sequence, and you can't do that in 4 years.
Right. What about the kids? I'm also wondering, what are the kids in 8th grade doing? As you mentioned, there's 25% of the kids right now who take Algebra 1 in 8th grade. So I assume the 75% are still doing whatever in 8th grade, but those 25% are doing what? Twiddling their thumbs? I mean, how bored must they be?
That is a huge concern. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. No, and that's a sad thing, that the people doing this don't seem to be that concerned about the well-being of that particular group, because they're, I guess, we can disregard them for maybe the benefit of the whole or something. It's unclear what they're thinking with respect to that.
Right. And yet they'll say things like, this reduces inequality. It helps everybody have, there's more equity in this plan. And I can see how it's more equity downward. You're denying acts, or literally taking the box away from the little kid standing in front of the baseball field, right? You're actually taking a box away or digging a hole underneath his legs so he's at the same height as everybody else. But what are we losing because of that? What is the child individually losing in terms of just even being remotely happy at school? And if you're really good at math and you just can't move ahead, and then what if their parents are super motivated and say, you know what, forget about it, we're going to do it privately. They are still going to get ahead, but now the other kids in the school don't have that same access. So you're perpetuating the inequality, actually.
Right. You're exacerbating it, really, is what's happening with this framework.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I found very interesting as a parent is to really look now, what does this mean in practice, and what are districts currently doing, just so you see what other districts do in comparison to where your own student and what their districts are. So I'm going to run through a few of these pathways just to show examples of what these districts are doing. So here's Irvine Unified School District. And so here you see math courses offered as a function of grade, and you see basically 5 course pathways. The top course pathway is a pathway for students who need more support, and the bottom course, the 2 course pathways at the bottom, are for students who are more interested in acceleration. And so you see that there, the Math Enhanced, which is Algebra 1, that starts in 8th grade, and that enables those students to end up with calculus, and they have calculus AB and calculus BC, and this is something we'll talk about later, the difference between these 2 versions of calculus. You also can see that the students can change pathways, so they're not like locked in from the beginning. But obviously, if they start on a slower pathway and they want an accelerated pathway, they're going to have to take some sort of bridge class to catch up. And then finally, a very interesting pathway is the middle pathway, because what it's showing is that for students who did delay taking algebra until 9th grade, there is a pathway towards getting to AP calculus by 12th grade. But you see they switch over to an accelerated track. And this is likely a very demanding set of courses because they're compacting 3 years into 2 years, essentially. And so, but it's available, but, that requires further acceleration.
Right.
Okay, so and here's just another one. This is now Dublin Unified School District. So again, the bottom 2 pathways are the pathways that allow the student to get to calculus. In this district, students start accelerating in 6th grade. They have options for that. And then the bottommost pathway is the pathway that enables students to get to calculus BC. And so they start with already taking some of algebra even as early as 7th grade. And then another point that's seen in this figure is this Algebra 2/Trig course that's like you see it in 10th grade. And the point, just because this comes up later, trigonometry is associated with the content of Algebra 2.
Okay. I do have one question that might come up from the audience, and that is, since we're looking at different school districts and they already do things differently, what if they, why would we think then that they would adopt the framework that is so radically different from what they're doing here? Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll say, we're not doing this because the parents rally around and say, we don't want to do this. What's the what's the pro con there as far as, them continuing to do what they're doing, them changing, what's the likelihood, do you think, that they would?
Well, it is hard to tell without really communicating with districts. But one thing I will show is, because I have communicated with some districts, and some districts have already openly in writing voiced opposition to these changes in pathways. And so I will certainly be discussing that a bit. But yes,
Okay.
A point is certainly that there are districts that realize the relevance of high achievement, and they're going to maintain these pathways for their students without
But
question.
then I think about the ones that go along with it for whatever reason. Let's say they go along with it purely for political reasons, because there is a political slant to the framework. It's undeniable. And it's like I've told my audience, it kind of goes along with some of the other equity math and some of the things we've seen. And I think that even further exacerbates inequality. And we get into the whole, like, this is public school. And, should you have to leave your zip code to get access to the math that your child needs? And it starts to feel like, even more exclusive, right? As far as, you live in Irvine, you're going to get one thing, you live in Dublin Unified, you get another thing. And while that's appropriate to a point, right? But if we're going to cut off, we're going to close doors this much. We're not just tweaking around the edges. We're really just making a completely different pathway. That seems like there'll be a whole bunch of kids, let's say Los Angeles Unified, or whatever, that they go ahead and they adopt the framework. That means every kid in Los Angeles, and that's a huge district, is kind of stuck there. And you're sort of assuming that none of them want this.
Right.
That
It
doesn't
is
seem
tragic.
right to me.
No, I totally agree, and that's how I became involved in this from the first place. Because yes, you literally could cross the proverbial train tracks and go from a district which has high achieving pathways to a district that doesn't. And so the school district that doesn't, those kids are systemically disadvantaged. There's a system in place that prevents them from having high achievement available to them.
Right.
Okay, and so here, this is now Cupertino, and then basically here you see also multiple pathways. So this is a middle school. You see that algebra is available in 7th grade. For some students, geometry available in even 8th grade. You see that you can readily change pathways. Now, one reason I brought this district up is because here is the LCAP for this district. And you can see that they very much pay attention to what they're doing for their English language learner students, as well as their socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And so, they have goals and they're trying to meet them. And they have basically 30% of these students in these advanced classes. So that, they're focused on this and they take pride in this. And then the next one is they have near gender equality in or equal numbers of females and males in these advanced classes. And that's a point because the framework is always repeatedly mentioning that girls are not in these advanced classes. So, well, why not look at what Cupertino does to get to this place?
Right. It does seem the framework, when I read through it, seems very negative and pessimistic and seems to be actively rejecting the reality of some of these districts. It's like, hey, we're doing it. Can you over here? But it's right here. They're like, nope,
Right.
we don't see that.
Right. Exactly. It's very confusing. You would think if you were to write a framework, what you would do is go around California, try to pick some of the districts that are doing things well, try to see what they're doing, and then incorporate it into a framework. And what we'll talk about later is what they did was they picked a district that's not doing things well, and they're doing what that district does instead. Okay, and this is now the high school for where the Cupertino kids go, and so they have these upper level sequence structures that are available, and they're 2 years long, and they start with pre-calculus. And so this means you need to have algebra 2 by 10th grade, so you want algebra again in 8th grade. They have 2 versions for geometry for the students, as well as algebra 2. And then they have, for these upper level sequences, 2 versions of pre-calculus. One is honors and one is just a pre-calculus. So the pre-calculus allows students to get to calculus AB, and then the honors version allows the students to get to calculus BC. And so here what I wanted to point out is there's starting to be this mention of how you can use your high school credit, your high school AP class to get college credit and pass out of college classes through what you're doing in high school. And this turns out to be very important.
David, can you address this from Jessica? She says, if some districts adopt this, but others don't, this means that students attending schools using the framework will not be able to transfer to schools not using the framework.
That is certainly, you'll transfer and you'll be quite behind, and you may have to go, I guess, into that pathway that needs more support or something like that. You'll have to go into one of the slowed down pathways, or you'll have to take a class over summer. I guess you can do an online class to catch up. But yes, it certainly presents a problem, and it is baffling for that reason.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and the final district I wanted to point out, this is Huntington Beach. And so again, on the right, you see that the path to calculus is 5 years, starting with algebra, if that turns out to be 8th grade, and then ending with calculus in 12th. They also have two versions, A, B, B, C of calculus, and then they have basically an accelerated version of each of those classes to get there. And then what you see here is in the green there, it's a data science class. And so what's really important to see from that is that there's no pathway from the data science class to calculus. And in fact, there's no pathway from the data science class to pre-calculus. And so this is an extremely important point that parents need to be aware of, and they can't get caught up in sort of the elegance of this particular class, that once they take this class, their future is determined, and they're not going to be taking any sort of calculus as they move on. And so it's a big concern. That's why I have it written there on the right twice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great.
Okay, and then finally, here are actually the Common Core state standards, and it even shows what it defines for different grades, what classes should be available. And so what you see here is algebra is supposed to be available even as early as 7th grade, and then geometry should start being available even as early as 8th grade. But clearly, even the state standards recognize that students will have different math course placement than his or her peers.
Right.
Okay, so a first thing that I really wanted to address is, now if we're going to consider removing this path to calculus, let's understand clearly why it is that districts have this available to their students. Why is it that taking calculus in high school can be beneficial? Why is it that the Common Core state standards say that this is a good and worthy goal? And so it's not just about college admissions, although this is very important because these students will be surrounded by students who have taken calculus. But basically, the mathematic principles learned in calculus are foundational to the upper level studies in STEM majors. And so for this reason, calculus sequence is a required sequence for the beginning of STEM majors. And so here's a quote from the framework where they're talking about calculus in high school, and they say, as is sometimes expected for many STEM majors. And so what I wanted to do is, well, let's look at this in practice. What does this actually really mean? And so what I did was I went to UC San Diego, which is where I went to school, and I just started looking at the various majors to see which majors required a calculus course. And so what these are screenshots I'm going to just quickly run through of majors with their required courses. And so here's bioengineering, biotechnology. So you can see calculus is required. Computer science, calculus is required. Chemistry, calculus is required. Oceanic and atmospheric sciences, calculus required. Aerospace engineering, calculus required. Data science, calculus required. So, and right here, a very important point. So if a student really wants to major in data science, they're going to be taking calculus in high school. And in college. And that high school data science class that we mentioned didn't prepare the students for calculus.
Right.
So those students, they would think, well, I took data science in high school, so now I'm prepared to take it in college. No, that's not at all the case. And in fact, it really should be that they shouldn't even call it data science because it's really so misleading for that reason. So it's a huge concern, that this aspect of it.
I have one other question. What about those people who might say, well, okay, they have to take calculus in college. What's the big deal? They'll take calculus in college. And so if they didn't get to it in the 5-year sequence because they didn't start algebra in 8th grade, so what? They'll take it in college. What if somebody says that?
Absolutely. So I will actually be discussing, there's 2 points with that. One is the high school class allows you to place out of the initial college class, which allows you to move on to the more technical electives, which really can help your career. And second, studies show that if you've taken it in high school, you'll actually do better in college when you retake it. And the point though is that the college calculus course, it can be a course of much greater rigor and level of challenge than a high school course. So you're not really retaking the same course. You're taking a course with a different level of rigor. And so the exposure you've had in high school is actually, I'll show a study, measurably can help those students who did it.
Whereas if you were dumped into it as a, a college student and you weren't prepared and you failed, now you're really behind.
Yeah, well, right.
I mean,
And
you
then
might
that,
have to
now,
change majors if you can't pass it.
right, in that drastic example, yes. But even kids that, like, let's say they would have gotten a C, the measurements say, well, their grade is actually improved, so maybe they would have got a B, those very students, if they had calculus in high school.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, so then now the experimentalist nature of myself got the better of me, and I really wanted to say, well, how many of these majors really do start with calculus? Let's really
Yeah.
take a look at it. So I decided to go through all the majors at UCSD and then make this table. And so what I found is there are 78 majors that start with a required calculus sequence. And so these majors, they fall in 16 different fields, and these fields are bioengineering, biological sciences, chemistry and biochemistry, cognitive science, computer science and engineering, data science, economics, electrical and computer engineering, global health, mathematics, mechanical and aerospace engineering, nanoengineering, physics, psychology, oceanography, and structural engineering. So there's basically a great breadth of fields that require a calculus beginning. And the reason for this is because it's foundational in the upper division studies that follow. And so what I found is that at least at UC San Diego, all STEM majors require a calculus starting sequence. And again, the majors that require calculus are from widely different. We have economics to psychology, biological sciences to data science, oceanography to chemistry. So we're not just talking engineering, math, and physics. So if parents think, oh, I only need calculus for those, no, not at all. You're greatly limiting yourself if you're not prepared for that. And that's
That's
why
so. I'm sorry.
oh, well, let me finish. And that's why I came to this point that what the framework says, as is sometimes expected for many STEM majors, right? So more accurate, or far more accurate, as is always expected for all STEM majors. And so this is important because this is a public policy document, and they need to be accurate. They can't be misleading. But part of this is they're just trying to basically deny the importance of calculus.
Okay. What I was going to say is I remember watching a video, and then I made a shorter video out of it for Save Math that was about where different people were talking about the framework and kind of defending it. It was like Tom Lovelace and who else was on there? Kathy, is it Kathy? I can't remember her last name. She works with Joe Bowler. Anyway, they were going back and forth, and there was another David in that panel.
David
And
Foster.
David Foster, and he was very cavalier about most students aren't going to take calculus. Most students don't need calculus. And I remember thinking at the time, like, that's not up to you to decide, first of all. And secondly, we don't need most students to take calculus. We need the students to take calculus who need to take calculus. Like, most people don't go into STEM fields. That's not the point. The point is you need people to go into STEM fields, and you need them to be properly prepared. So you don't write off the 25, let's say it's 25%. You don't write them off like they did with the 8th graders who need algebra because, well, most people don't need this. Most people are ever going to use it. Most people I mean, we just don't work that way. That's not, I don't know. I just don't see how you make responsible educational decisions based on what you perceive or even what you can statistically prove most people don't do.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. You want to serve all students as best as you can. You don't want to just take away from some for some reason that you're coming up with. But with respect to that particular comment, I actually want to show that data because it's another example of how they're really misrepresenting what the data say on that very particular question. Okay. So here, this is this point I'm making, that you can use calculus to place out your high school AP calculus to place out of your college calculus. And so here is a screenshot from UCSD, which is describing this. And basically what it's showing is you can use your BC version, your AB version of calculus to pass out of place out of one semester and then, or one quarter, it turns out, and then you use your BC AP Calculus to place out of 2 quarters at UC San Diego. So this is a UC school. So then I went to a private university and looked at Stanford. And so they also do this there. You can use AP credit towards the math major. And here's the cryptography degree. You can use AP calculus to satisfy the requirements for your initial calculus year. So you can place out of those and go on to the technical electives. And here is actually a service academy. So this is the United States Naval Academy. So even there at a service academy, that you can validate their calculus or place out by, and again, the same thing, the AB allows you to place out of 1 and the BC allows you to place out of 2. And so this is apparent. It's very common in the colleges that they allow you to do this. So I showed for a UC, a private institution, and a service academy. And basically these colleges, they have no interest in forcing you to repeat something you already know. Now you might have to take a test to sort of prove that you actually did all this, but nonetheless, you are able to do this.
Right.
Okay, so the benefits from doing this are shown in this slide here. So what happens if you place out, you move past these general courses, and now you get to move on to the technical electives of the major. So these technical electives, they look better on resumes, they better prepare a student for interviews, they better prepare a student for a STEM career. And if a student has satisfied these course requirements, you know, in their senior year, now all of a sudden what they have available to them are internships, collaborations with professors, independent study, honors thesis, double majors, and all of these build connections, which that's really a big part of a STEM career. It's not like you just do these by yourself and all of a sudden get a job. You know, you have an internship, and then now you've worked with a professor. Now that professor can give you a letter of recommendation. And so for myself, I was placed out of the initial calculus by the AP, taking AP in high school. And then what I did as a senior, because it was very obvious that I was going to be able to graduate, partly because I was able to get through that first, get into the technical electives, what I did is I volunteered myself to work in a lab for a professor that was doing research that seemed very interesting to me. So then I went with him with my resume, which at that point in my life is just the courses I've taken, right? So he can see all the technical electives that I've had. And then, you know, so the only other thing I have on the resume is what I was paid to do at the time, which is wash dishes in the dish room, right? But so he took me on, and then I did well as in this volunteer position. So then he decided to take me on as a graduate student. So that's how I got into graduate school. Then I did well in graduate school and, you know, got my PhD. And then when you go to get a job in a STEM field, you know, you do the interview, and then you usually give a presentation on your research, but you also, of course, have the recommendation from your advisor. So all of these stem through this type of communication that is occurring and getting these letters of recommendation. And so for me personally, at least for my career, I view the fact that I was able to place out of calculus to be a very important part of how I was able to achieve what I did in my STEM career. And that's why when I learned that they're thinking about removing this for students, I'm very baffled by this decision. And then especially as you point out, you find out later, well, it's really only going to be for some students. You know, students with resources were still going to have that pathway available for them.
How many people in your line of work were involved in putting together the framework?
Oh, there's, yeah, that, I mean, so the answer is nobody. And they really don't, they haven't, one of the big problems is they have really not consulted STEM professionals. If I think I'm answering your question. And that's why you have this open letter signed by STEM professionals, you know, 1,700, you know, just, you know, and they're mainly college professors saying, you know, what are you doing? This is not how it works. You know, you should consult with us because it's not how it works. You're not helping these kids. And that was the purpose of this open letter. And it is, again, another baffling aspect of this. Why aren't they consulting with the STEM community? Why aren't they listening to what the STEM community is telling them? But in the end, they're not.
And yet the op-eds I've read defending it and saying how great it is, they all talk about how this is going to be this great equalizer to get more historically marginalized kids into STEM. And it sounds like it's not going to get any kids or more of any kind of kid into STEM.
You're absolutely correct, and it's very misleading language. And again, just go to the open letter, which is signed by, and look at who's signing it. It's 1,700 college professors. You just see UC Berkeley, UCI, UC this, and you just go down. Director of some data storage business. I mean, countless numbers of them are just saying, no, what are you doing? And so, yeah, right. It's just not the case.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and so yeah, I mentioned, so what these help you do is you get more impactful letters of recommendation, because if you have a professor you worked with, it's more significant than just a professor who taught you. So the students are better prepared for graduate school, study abroad programs become more accessible. And another point I think is the technical electives, they're really the fun part of the major. So the sooner you get onto those, the more engaged you'll be with the major. But and a really significant point of this is cost. And so if you're able to place out of some of the calculus classes, it's more likely you'll be able to graduate in a timely fashion, 4 years versus 5. And this can be very significant for a student with less resources in view of how expensive education is. And so I have a message here, take calculus in high school while it is free.
Yep.
So it's important to not underestimate what this gains students. It opens doors in many ways, and if a student is prepared and motivated, they should definitely be enabled to do this. Okay, and so part of what I just mentioned is recognized in this open letter that's signed by these STEM professionals. So here's a quote from it, and they mention that students who spend their early years taking introductory math courses may require more time to graduate. They may have to give up other opportunities, and they may be more likely to struggle academically. And then the bottom one as well comes from that, because it opens up internships and research opportunities. So they recognize these. And so these benefits are tangible and significant. But, as you said, it's not like you have to do it, and I think you had a woman in one of your recent podcasts who she said, she was not able to take calculus because it wasn't offered to her, but she still has a STEM career. So you can still do it, but it's obviously way better if you can have these types of advantages. And the thing is, you're going to be surrounded by students who are taking advantage of these pathways.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so the last part I wanted to mention about calculus in high school comes from this study, which looked at 6,000 students, and it looked at how they did when they took calculus in high school and then took it again in college. And so this was a very careful and detailed study. And so one of the points they start off making is, again, so that a college calculus class is a step up in rigor from a high school calculus class. So it's not like you're retaking the same class. You're taking a class with a step up in difficulty. They especially they say expectations and at the level of practice standards can be very different. And so what they find, like, the measurements, they go through and actually analyze all the data. They find that the students who took calculus in high school end up with a higher grade than the students who did not. And they find that students with relatively weak backgrounds appear to even benefit the most from having taken calculus in high school. So the point here, kind of like what you said, is that taking calculus in high school could be the difference between passing the college calculus class and not. And so that's why these authors conclude being exposed to calculus in high school clearly pays off when students enroll in college calculus. And a point about this study is also it's only looking at the groups of students that took calculus in college again. So it's not including the group of students that placed out by using the AP test. So those are the highest achieving students. So those benefits are actually not even included in this study. So they're seeing these benefits even without those students.
Right.
So the point is that we're seeing why it is so important to have this available to students in high school. And this is the reason, again, why the Common Core State Standard said, this is a good and worthy goal. Take calculus in high school if you can. And so this is why these districts are doing it. Okay, so now we're going to get on to what it is that the framework is guiding for. And here is the pathway chart that the framework is guiding for. And what you see here is there's actually, so there's three pathways: the algebra, algebra pathway, and then the integrated math pathway is the second. And then they have this third pathway, the MIC pathway. So remember what I said, that the integrated 1 through 3 and the algebra geo pathways, they're basically the same. So what this means is districts, there will only be really two pathways left. And so I want to talk more about this figure, but first I want to go on and talk about what do we know about this MIC pathway. Okay, so this is summarized here, and then it turns out in the end, what do we know about MIC? And not very much. The framework has very little description about what material is covered in this class. They give clues about what this class is, and so here are some quotes from the framework. The course has many student investigations driven by data. Students generate questions, design data collection, search for available existing data, analyze data, and represent data and results of analysis. So the courses can be designed by emphasizing data-driven investigations. Data-driven investigations, students begin by searching for, gathering, or examining data about their authentic questions.
Authentic questions.
Yes. Right.
Authentic. I wonder where they're going to get those. Let's all take the implicit bias test and then calculate how many of us turned out to be really racist and then how many of us weren't. And then let's compare and contrast. I mean, I've seen some problems in certain math books around the country. And whenever I see this, data this and, and students will gather, I become very cynical, because you have to have a wealth of background knowledge to even begin to do anything remotely worthwhile or intelligent with this kind of an activity. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it could be, your data is how many cantaloupes do you have? I mean, what kind of data are we looking at? And I can't help but believe that the teachers are going to be helpfully supplying them with social science data and the like.
Right. And a lot of these topics, you have to spend a long time even to become educated enough to even really talk about some of these data analysis topics.
Because it's not linear. They approach these things very often as if, there's a linear relationship between the topics, and there isn't. And so they're also miseducating the students, not just not educating them in math, but they're miseducating them as far as social science goes. Right. And I'm only inserting that because I know, having read some of the framework and the framework examples, when they get to this kind of stuff and they give example problems, it's like, what? That doesn't seem like a math problem.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah, that is a big concern. And so that it goes on to how they kind of view reducing math to, and here's their quote, telling stories with data. That comes out of the framework. So now, in contrast, here is what an Algebra 2 course is described, and I'm actually taking the description out of the framework, and so to compare to what this MIC 3 course was, and I'm going to read this. So building on their work with linear, quadratic, and exponential functions, students in Algebra 2 extend their repertoire of functions to include polynomial, rational, and radical functions. Students work closely with the expressions that define the functions and continue to expand and hone their abilities to model situations and solve equations, including solving quadratic equations over the set of complex numbers and solving exponential equations using properties of logarithms. And so when I read this, it's like, well, if you want to go on to calculus, which class would you take? And I think it's pretty obvious from these descriptions. And the point here is, what content is being removed from the Algebra 2 or the Integrated Math 3 course to make up for all these many student investigations driven by data? And so that's what the huge concern is. And so these students, they're just simply not getting the content. And that's why Brian Conrad, what he recommends in his public comment, elimination of all discussion of the confusing MIC proposal that is devoid of a clear purpose and a reasonable level of detail. And so basically, this MIC pathway is not something a STEM student would take.
No, I mean, it seems, I'll be honest, if I were a parent and my kid was looking at what to register for, and they said, well, there's this class, I'd be like, yeah, I don't think you should take a class where you have no idea what the description even means.
Absolutely. Very
It's
good
like
point.
it could be anything. That could be, and I don't know. I'm very leery of education changes to education, frameworks, pedagogies, whatever, that are unintelligible by the average person. Because if a parent can't understand it, right, and if the
Right.
people who wrote it can't quickly and easily explain it, but it has no, a student could accidentally wander into something that changes the direction of their future in a negative way. And why would you even allow for that possibility? It should be very clear what they're going to get.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that it's very disconcerting why they left this undefined, because I guess then later they can put in whatever they want. And yeah, so
Right.
it's very disconcerting, and it's definitely raising alarms. Okay. So, and part of this now goes to this open letter on data science, which is signed by 400 academic staff. And so, part of what they're saying is, we write to emphasize that for students to be prepared for STEM and other quantitative majors in a 4-year colleges, including data science, learning the Algebra 2 curriculum in high school is essential. So it's clear that this MIC pathway is not something a student would take for interested in a STEM career. Parents need to be made aware of this before their child takes this pathway. Parents should not be misled about this. It's very important to understand this, very important that parents understand this, and it's very important that parents are clearly told this. Because otherwise, students arrive at college and they're just simply not prepared, and they find out, too late, and they'll be surrounded by classmates who have taken calculus or are at least prepared for calculus. So taking this MIC3 pathway disadvantages them, unbeknownst even to them. And this is also very disconcerting, because the framework says that high schools will typically offer one of these pathways, one of those 3 pathways. So I was saying 2, but they're saying, well, 1. So this means that the high school might actually choose between a STEM pathway and not. And so that is a very disconcerting statement in the framework.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so going back to this cloud schematic that the authors of the framework have come up with. Okay, so now we know that really there is only one STEM pathway. And the framework says it's reflecting a common 9th and 10th grade experience. And we know that the MIC3, the Algebra 2 and Integrated Math 3 course is in 11th grade. So this means that algebra is now delayed until 9th grade. And a point here is, just because they have this cloudy topmost pathway, sending the kids up in a cloud does not mean that they're going to catch up from what they've been caused to be behind in. Because calculus is this 5-year sequence, and they're allowing only 4 years. And so part of this, you see here, what their version of calculus they have for the kids is this course, calculus plus trigonometry. So not AP calculus AB or AB calculus BC, calculus plus trig. And we already know that trig is something associated with algebra 2. So their vision of calculus for students is some very watered down version of calculus. Okay, and so then you come to this point, well, which pathway, which district would a parent prefer for their kid, and which districts is best for the kid? And so, I'm comparing these two, the one on the left not using the framework, or the one on the right using the framework. The one with multiple pathways, or the one where there's one pathway. And, the one with the cloudy pathways. So if parents could choose, what would they choose? And I think, and if parents could vote, which one would they vote for? And I think a point is, parents, they do vote. They can vote with their ballots, or they can vote with their feet. So this is a very significant issue.
Right. But some can't vote with their feet. I mean, there will be some that are just trapped. And what I think is so disingenuous is to claim that your framework, improves equity and reduces inequality and all these things, when it does precisely the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really bears repeating over and over again that you don't improve outcomes by making things easier. That doesn't help. Okay. I'm actually reading a book right now about anti-fragility. And it talks about how human beings, like most creatures in nature, actually require a certain amount of stress to improve and be healthy. I mean, what happened for 2 years when we sat on our couches and ordered takeout, right? We got more sick and we got fat and we got all that. Okay. We're supposed to push ourselves. We're supposed to have a certain amount of stress. It's obviously you don't want stress to the point of, being in pain, but maybe a little. I mean, I can attest to that when I went from a school that was kind of too easy, public school, and I was like a fair to middling student, and then I went to rigorous private school, my grades went way up. The work was so much harder. It's not even comparable, but my grades went up because everyone around me was striving for excellence. That was the standard. The standard wasn't, oh, you poor thing, that's really hard. Let's make it easier. Let's make it more of this other thing. It was step it up, kiddo. But in a nice way, obviously in a
Right.
caring way. And I just think two things. I think if a parent buys the lie that, well, my kid will get better grades and that's good, right? I mean, if it's easier, maybe I should be in this cloudy pathway, because if it's like a little more accessible, these words like accessible or all these kinds of things, or equitable, they might be fooled into thinking it's good for their child, just like they're trying to sell it that way, and look at the other one and say, that looks really scary and hard and I don't even understand it. And so I'm going to deny my kid that. But as you pointed out, the kid in 6th grade or 8th grade doesn't necessarily know what they need or what they're good at. Sometimes it takes exposure to actually realize, hey, I really like this. And I've seen that in my own children. That when they came back out of the public school and were homeschooling and doing math at the higher level, they were already good math students, but then it was like, I really have to push myself. Like, this is actually fun. Okay. So I think when I read the stuff that's written about the framework, it's like they need to enjoy math more. They need to love math more. And math is too boring and math is too this. I'm like, then maybe you have a teaching problem. And maybe you need to work with your teachers, or maybe you need to redefine what's interesting or something. But I just think this isn't the solution. And so you asked, what would a parent think? I think it depends on the parent, and it depends on which PR they're buying. Not every parent is knowledgeable about how to make these choices for their child. And I think to a great degree, they're looking to the school to help them with that. They're counting on the expertise of the people who write these things. They probably assume there are STEM professionals involved when there aren't, or assume there are lots of mathematicians, not a person who is at the Graduate School of Education math.
Right. Right. And I think even a point here, though, is, certainly there may be some students who might want this type of thing for whatever reason, but that does not mean you take it away from the students who do want all this stuff. And yes, your point about being challenged and pushed, and this idea that, I don't know, that life is supposed to be stress free. Yeah, it's just not at all the way a STEM career works, certainly. And I don't understand personally, you look at how athletics, I mean, kids are pushed extremely hard in athletics with, there's not much worry about that. And it's used to get them to pretty advanced levels. But, why is it all of a sudden different when it comes to math?
Shouldn't be. It isn't different. Your brain works the same way as your muscles. I mean, in that respect, like your brain is actually designed to adapt and strengthen itself for what it will imagine is going to be harder than the most hard thing it just did. So just like your muscles, when you're lifting weights, part of what makes you stronger is that you overcompensate. Well, you overcompensate in your neural pathways too. So you do something really challenging. You don't just go back to where you were before the challenging thing. You go back to a little bit higher than the most challenging thing you did before, and you actually get smarter. I mean, you get better over time. And the younger you start this process, the greater capacity you have for that. It's harder to come in, let's say in college, to your point, and say, okay, now I'm going to take the hardest math I've ever taken. That's going to be much, much harder than if you ramped up sooner with more and more rigor when you were younger.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And teachers I talk to, what they say is, the best way to get engaged in math is to learn math and become good at math. That is the most successful way. Okay. So it's important, though, to point out there are certain statements in this framework which end up being self-contradictory. So we've talked about the framework says reflect a common 9th and 10th grade experience so they're clearly guiding for a one-size-fits-all approach to math. But then they say advanced students may complete that pathway in an accelerated fashion to access additional advanced mathematics courses. So now they appear to be guiding for multiple pathways. But then it quickly qualifies this with, or as described in Chapter 9, they may be offered additional or supplemental challenges within or beyond the courses they take in their pathway. So now we're going back to what they are really guiding for, which is any sort of advancement is supposed to occur within the confines of the one-size-fits-all model. And then to make it finally perfectly clear, they put the pathway chart up there, and it's like, okay, well, where are the accelerated pathways? You know, all the other districts show them, the state standards show them that they're not there. And so a point is this guidance of in one case, one pathway, but then acting like they also can have other pathways at the same time. These are incompatible. These are mutually exclusive, and this is self-contradictory. So we have now this public policy document that is obviously self-contradictory. And the way I look at it is, you imagine if parents called a district and said, hey, do you have accelerated pathways? And the district said, yes, we do. And then they show up and then here's their pathway chart. And the parents say, well, where are the accelerated pathways? Well, we actually don't offer them just because we didn't want to get criticized. And that's essentially what's happening here. Okay, and so these types of contradictory statements, I wanted to mention one more because they write out certain very specific examples of pathways. And so here's one. It says Kai is interested in robotics engineering, was able to take integrated 1 and 2 in junior high and integrated 3 during the first year of high school. By completing pre-calculus in the second year, Kai was able to take AP calculus in the third year. And so the question is, in a district that's adopting the framework's guidance, which is this framework recommends that all students take the same mathematics courses in kindergarten through grade 8, how did this student accelerate by 2 years, you know, not 1, but 2 years over their peers? And it just doesn't. So this pathway could only occur in a district that's not adopting the framework. And so, I mean, right?
We're going to sell our framework by talking about a district that doesn't use our framework.
Right. That is really what it appears to be what's happening. And so the bottom line is these math pathways need to be clearly defined. That, you know, they can't be cloudy, you know, and pun intended there, right? And as they are, you know, we looked at these other districts and in the state standards, very clear. And so public policy guiding the education of 6 million kids cannot be self-contradictory. So basically, if they mean it, this acceleration, then put the pathways on the chart, you know, and get rid of this common experience language. And I just have to say, you know, for me, what comes to mind with this, there's an episode in that show, The Office, maybe you're familiar with, but the manager, he's having money problems, and one of his less coherent employees tells him, hey, just declare bankruptcy. And so then he walks out into the middle of the office and says, I declare bankruptcy. Right. And then his accountant says, you know, that's not how it works. You can't just say it. You know, you got to do it. And that's what I feel like when I'm reading this framework. You know, you can't just say, I declare advanced pathways. No, I mean, you got to do it. You got to get rid of this language denying it, and you got to put it on your chart.
But you also can't just say students will like math more.
Right.
You know, like students will enjoy math. And it's like, what? You haven't even broken down what the definition of enjoy is, or love math, or these kind of phrases that involve emotion. It's like, what does that even mean? There are plenty of people out there who won't think of math in terms of like, I love it or I like it, but they're doing it. They're successful at it, and that they derive some satisfaction from that. But then if you ask them, like, do you like it? They're like, not really, but I'm really glad I'm taking it, or I'm really glad I'm doing well in the course or something. I was probably one of those kids, especially with algebra. I didn't like or do well with geometry, but once I got to algebra, it was kind of like a light bulb came on. Maybe it's the logic part of it or something. I don't know, but I really liked it. But I wasn't like, I love math class. I just finally liked that math made sense, because I could do the problem. Like I could actually do the work. Now, in part was I had a good teacher who did a lot of examples and made sure we mastered a concept before we moved on to the next concept, which was something my other teachers had not done. But I liked it because I was able to do it. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Mhm.
I think if you talk to a lot of students, they'll say that about a lot of subjects. Like, well, my favorite is this, but I don't hate that class. I'm getting a B or I'm getting an A or whatever. So I'm not sure the value of loving something for its own sake.
Hmm, hmm. Yes.
That wouldn't be a
Yeah.
goal as an educator. It's like,
Right. Yeah, you want it to be able to do it. And you just brought up an interesting point because I've met several people who said, math just clicked for me when I hit algebra. And
yeah,
it was the same for me too. And I think what happens at that point, all of a sudden, all the deductive parts really start coming more to the forefront of what's going on. I'll never forget when my high school algebra teacher derived the quadratic equation on the chalkboard. I mean, I don't know, I think it took like 15 minutes or something, but I was just like, wow, just how cool that you could rationally go through that whole process. And it was really the first time I had ever, seen that type of thing, going through and proving something. Yeah, it was really impressive.
yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, you like it because you can see, that you're able to do it. I don't know. Like I said, I found that the subjects I ended up loving were the ones that I felt successful at, and I felt like it made sense, and I wasn't just sitting there in the dark. And that, like I said, whenever I see language in the framework that talks about, loving math or enjoying math, I don't get that goal. I really don't.
Right. Yeah. And because you have to make sure, are you enjoying some other topic or the math itself? And it becomes
Exactly.
very confusing. Yeah.
Is it the activity or is it the
Right.
math?
Exactly. Yes. Okay, so here we go, Deb. We were talking about some districts responding to this, and so I did want to go over this because there's two districts who have actually actively spoken out against or made a statement about how they feel about pathways, and they're going to maintain their pathways. And so I wanted to read these just because to hear the language that these districts actually talk about.
Yeah.
So the top one is Cupertino. So it says, "Dear Cupertino families, currently the CDE is considering shifts to the mathematics framework for California public schools, kindergarten through grade 12. Parents have raised questions about what this will mean for our schools. We are writing to provide information and reassurance regarding the implications of these shifts for our students. Local districts have the authority to utilize recommendations in the framework or choose another path that better aligns with the needs of their students. In 2018, Cupertino engaged in a year-long process to gather community feedback about student experiences in math. These conversations began with the following aims: ensure that our middle school students are placed in math courses that match their learning skills and interests. Cupertino is not planning to make shifts to our math courses in the foreseeable future, and we do not anticipate that a revised state framework will significantly impact our mathematics pathways. So here's one district that's saying right out, we're going to keep things the way they are. And why not? We saw their LCAP. They're doing great. And they've worked hard at it. They've involved the parents and they're doing a great work. I mean, it'd be very interesting to hear more about what this district is doing. And so a
It just
second one,
it just bothers me that they didn't go out and seek out, more information from these districts and say, how can we take what you're doing and translate that across more schools? First of all, can we? And if so,
mhm,
how? Why wouldn't you want to take
right,
what's working? And
exactly. Because like one thing you'll see, like these say that these data sets on testing is a function of something, and you'll see all over the place all these outlying districts that for low SED all of a sudden they're doing really well, and not just one, but quite a few relative of whatever the hundreds there are. That's like, well, what are they doing? Why don't you go? Let's talk to them, see what they're doing. Maybe they have an answer because whatever worked for them. But yeah, that's just apparently not the way. I mean, there's no mention of that in the framework. Like, here's a district that was successful. Here's what they did. Let's try this. No, not even
I'm
close.
I'm also concerned that if they're looking at results today and saying there's inequity today,
Mhm.
before this framework is put in place, I can't imagine what it's going to be in 7 years when they compare themselves to Beverly Hills and Cupertino. And what's the argument going to be then? Do they need to actively go and suppress what's happening in Beverly Hills and Cupertino in order to continue to justify? Because that's what I've noticed is the impulse is not to say, wow, we messed up.
Mm-hmm.
It's to say, see, that's evidence of racism, or that's evidence of elitism, or, you know, money, or extra this or extra that, like privilege or something. And instead of saying no, they actually gave it a lot of thought, and they chose something intentionally and deliberately that was working, and they kept doing it. And you had every opportunity to do it also, and you didn't. But I don't see that happening. Like politically, I
Mm-hmm.
don't see
Right.
any will for somebody to stand up and say, I mean, it could even be the governor, right? You know, to just say, wait, hang on a second. What are you doing? Like, where's that? I've seen the open letter.
Certainly, right. You would certainly think so. And I just, it seems like it just needs to get a lot more people need to be somehow upset before all of a sudden these people start realizing what they've done. But that's what's so sad about this. They need to realize now, before this thing gets adopted, what's actually happening.
I just think they're going to blame these people, and it's not their fault that they're doing the
Right.
right
Well,
thing.
and even you had that podcast a few back where you talked about, well, the content standards. And so that's what, you know, they did these things, but and in the end, I guess it didn't work. And so now they're going to blame the standards, right? So they'll always
Exactly.
find something else to blame except for themselves.
Right. And then, of course, they come in with the solution conveniently.
Right. Well, but as you said, 7 years from now, I mean, things could be considerably worse. And then what? You know, what are they going to say then?
Right.
Okay, and so I did want to read this. I'll try really quick here. So we do not, however, believe that this framework in its current form ensures optimal benefits for students. Our Board of Education then began a discussion regarding the framework and have correspondingly formulated the following letter to articulate our position opposing the framework in its current form. So urges the CDE to reconsider limited options it provides to our middle school and subsequently high school students. In Beverly Hills, we have worked hard over the past 3 years to develop new middle school pathways with open access opportunities for our students in middle school classroom setting. We firmly believe in this work and have ample data exemplifying the student performance and growth through these pathways, which allows students to access algebra and geometry even as early as 7th grade. We ask that the CDE reconsider the proposed framework denying access to algebra and geometry to middle school students. And then to be fair, this was actually for the previous draft, but these things are still relevant to the current draft.
Right.
Okay, so the point here is, though, this creates a situation that we've been discussing where now some districts are going to adopt this framework and some are not. So then students in districts that have this framework adopted or with the pathways removed are going to be systemically disadvantaged. And this will lead to the disparities becoming exacerbated. And in one of the open letters, there's a quote. It says, "It may lead to de facto privatization of advanced mathematics in K through 12 education and disproportionately harm students with fewer resources." Because, you know, obviously, whenever students have to go outside the public school system for education, obstacles are in place. Whenever obstacles are in place, it's the students with less resources that become more disadvantaged. So we always have to bear in mind that other districts won't be doing this, but on top of that, right, it's the private schools, other states, other countries, you know, they're not going to be doing this. They're going to continue to provide these high achieving pathways for their students. And it's only, you know, these students in these districts which are going to suffer. Okay, so it turns out that there's actually a law in place to protect students from this very thing, and it's called the Math Placement Act. And so this is very important. So you see some of the words here. A pupil's 9th grade math course placement is crucial. And egregious examples of mathematics misplacement occur with successful pupils. They're testing proficient, and yet they're held back to repeat like 8th grade material. So this law is very aware of basically these concerns that we're talking about. And what's also clear in this law is that they're very aware that the placement of one student may be completely different than his or her peers. So this common experience, this law realizes that that's not supposed to be the case. So this law then states a school district maintaining grades 9 through 12 shall not assign a pupil enrolled to a course that pupil has previously completed. So this is now a law. A fair and objective and transparent mathematics placement policy for all pupils, timely recourse to those who oppose this. So this law is actually protecting students from what this framework is doing. So if you have a district that adopts this framework, strictly speaking, with a common experience, 9th and 12th, all students in the same class until grade 8, you have a student that took algebra in eighth grade and comes into this district and expects to take geometry in 9th grade, but the district doesn't offer it to them because of this common experience and makes them repeat the class. Is that district violating the law? And it would appear that they are. So this law is very powerful, and it's good that it's here. And I think this will become very useful as we go on to fight this.
What's the enforcement mechanism? I mean, is it parents?
Yeah, sadly, it looks like what has to happen is a parent has to have enough resources, to sue the district. And I know some of this is actually going on now. I mean, districts are getting sued over this very thing. But we'll have to see. It'll be very interesting how these lawsuits play out.
But to sort of reinforce the point that the avenues to protect your child are more available to people with means and the people with the knowledge. If you're an English language learner or a recent immigrant or something like that, this may be beyond your grasp. You may not even be aware of any of this.
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't know any of this, certainly, as of 2 years ago, right? I mean, I'm only aware of this because people have pointed this out to me, and or you see it like Brian Conrad. He writes about this. He points out all the places in the framework where they're violating this law.
Right.
Now, and so this is, if I were a politician, this is sort of my dream. And I think, the Math Placement Act, but there should be a Math Pathway Act, where all districts have a pathway starting with algebra in 8th grade, enabling the student to get to calculus BC in 12th grade. And this needs to be made seamlessly available as possible for all students, because I can guarantee that every district in California will have some students that can do this. And so it's very sad that some students will just simply not have this available to them. And again, there's this movie, Stand and Deliver, which actually was a docudrama, which discussed and showed this very, very topic.
Right.
Okay, so a second issue that I want to discuss here is the framework is guiding to remove standards-based instruction. And so the way this is phrased is avoid organizing around the detailed content standards and instead organize around big ideas. Now, in and of itself, this type of language isn't necessarily so bad, because all teachers, you want to give context to what you're teaching. You want to give the big picture and sort of the big idea. But the problem in this framework, being a framework, is these big ideas are ill-defined, and what they cover is ill-defined. And so here's a quote: in a big idea, the student will likely encounter many different content standards. So not all of them. Likely, they might not. Right? So it's very disconcerting. Students investigate or struggle with situations or questions about which they actually wonder. So, if they don't wonder about the content standards, does that mean they're not covered? If they were wondering about the ending of Game of Thrones that week, does that mean there are no content standards covered? So it's a significant concern. And are they simply just not taught because it's not defined in the framework that should happen? And it's a concern because you have these data where it says only 40% of California students have met achievement proficiency standards. And a point is that a framework is expected to provide guidance to support implementing the California content standards. Yet this framework, someone did this analysis, only devotes 6% of its text to implementing the content standards. And so to contrast this, the framework currently in place, 2013, devotes 66% of its text to implementing the content standards, because that's what the framework is supposed to do. It's supposed to guide the implementation of these standards.
And it's still only 66%.
Well, I mean, I guess there has to be some.
I mean, I'm just saying, like we discussed at the outset, maybe if you want fewer standards, then go after the standards and have fewer of them. It would be like saying we have too many laws on the books, so we're only going to enforce 66% of them. And you're like, okay, maybe we get rid of some of them. Like this, if they
Right.
don't belong there, then let's get rid of them. But we have to have that debate. We have to have that conversation. But to take it down to 6,
Right.
that makes me wonder as a parent, and maybe you've had the same question, like, what all are you occupying my child's time with that you only have time? Is it that? Is it that you only are going to have time to cover 6% of the standards? Or are you effectively writing new standards in a
Mm.
backdoor kind of way by ignoring the vast majority of the standards? See, that's really writing new ones without going through the proper process.
Right, and that is the big concern, that these things are happening without sort of the proper process, without evaluating which standards should be covered. Talk to the college professors, talk to the what students need in high school, and then if standards could be removed, then after great discussion, then remove them. But to be clear, this is the amount of text covering the standards. Not It doesn't mean only 6% of the standards are covered
Well,
necessarily, but it's just showing, it's de-emphasizing. It's not teaching teachers how to teach the standards, which is what it's supposed to do.
right. And as Michael points out, many third graders are no longer being taught to memorize the single digit multiplication facts, even though the standards require it. And this is, I want to speak to my audience here. Remember when I said, pay attention to California, these things spread around the country? This is true all over the place. I'm not saying every district or every school, but this is happening all over the country. They are just not teaching your children the multiplication tables to memorize their multiplication facts. And you, as a parent, are probably assuming they are. No, they're not. You need to actually find out from the specific teacher if they're doing this. And then guess what happens when they get to fractions?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I had to point that out.
No, it's important to point that out, and again, then students with resources will
Yep.
have other ways of dealing with that. Okay, but so what the framework does end up envisioning for math classes does come out with these many vignettes that and you were referring to some of them that the framework talks about. And I just wanted to briefly mention one here, and it's a high school geometry class, and it starts off with actually a problem that's fairly interesting. So a farmer has 36 individual fences, each measuring 1 meter in length, and that the farmer wants to put them together to make the biggest possible area. So there is a math problem there. But then what the vignette says is the teacher takes time to ask her students about their knowledge of farming. So now again, every teacher needs to contextualize things, but it's you kind of have to. I mean, I'm not a teacher, but you dip out, right, and then you make sure the student right gets back to focusing on math. And so this one, asking students about their knowledge of farming. If you have 20 students in the class, I don't know, what does this mean? You ask each one, and each one gets to talk about it. I'm not, yeah, how much time is involved with that? So then making reference to California's role in the production of fruit, vegetables, and livestock. So this, now we have a significant topic, maybe better suited for even another class. But furthermore, and now a teacher is going to use their prep time. I'm sure they're quite busy, but now they have to educate themselves on these three different facts. And teachers don't like to complain about how overworked they are, but their prep time, they're busy, and they might need to really focus on prepping for the math problem. And so then next, what happens, the students engage in an animated discussion about farms. So I like here, I can just imagine walking
I'm
into this
sorry.
class.
I'm sorry.
Right? You just walk into this class and you're like, I'm sorry, was this the math class, or am I in a history or social science classes, right? So it's really getting quite far away from the math problem. And then finally, and the reasons a farmer may want a fenced area. And this one, I don't know. This one really threw me because I thought it was pretty obvious, but maybe they're getting at something like private property, or maybe something like farms versus nature. And I'm really not sure where they're actually going with this
Well,
one.
you're not really supposed to fence things off when you have communal everything. So,
That could be where they're going with this. But yeah, yeah, it's really not clear. But so you have all these students in this animated discussion, and you go into this, and then as far as I can see, well, the class ended, right? And so now you have these students going home, and their parents say, "Hey, how was your math class?" "Oh, it was great. It was really fun, right? It was really engaging." "Well, did you do any math?" "No." Right? So because this is what they spent their time doing. And meanwhile, you have the student who actually really wanted to do some geometry, and they didn't get to do any.
Right.
So now we have this problem. So students in districts that adopt the framework are going to be more likely to learn, that don't adopt the framework, more likely to learn the standards, more likely to be proficient, while students in districts that adopt the framework, less likely to learn the standards, less likely proficient. Students with resources use education outside the public school system to learn the standards, while students that rely wholly on the public school system in districts that adopt the framework will be systemically disadvantaged. So disparities will be exacerbated, the achievement gap widens. And that's what seems to be coming out of this.
Right.
Okay, and so I wanted to mention these other differences in ideology between the framework and the state standards. So we've already talked about that the state standards say calculus is a good and worthy goal. Well, one of the authors of the framework says, if you can point to anything in the document that you still read as a push to calculus, it would be great to know, because that's absolutely not what we intended in writing it. Well, so, mission accomplished on their part with that one.
Why
And
do they
so,
call it the push to calculus like it's a bad thing?
right, it's really it's kind of they use language to try to make things, deliberately make things sound bad to try to serve their need, and not understanding that there's a lot of students that are really happy with that pacing, and they're really happy with getting to calculus, and it's the right pacing for them. 25% of people take algebra in 8th grade. They're a lot of those students are absolutely ready for it.
Right.
And
Right.
so, yeah, the language, one thing that came to me when I'm starting reading this, the language used to describe these terms, it's so deliberate, like, the rush to calculus, even this term tracking, it sounds like you're putting chips on kids and sending them through the system. Why don't they just call it, pathways, advanced pathways? And, in this term, there's another term, heterogeneous classes. That sounds great, right? Everyone wants heterogeneous friends, a wide variety. But, in the end, what that means is one size fits all. And so, the language chosen is very odd with respect to how they do this type of thing.
And I'd like to speak to that as well. Having been a student who was very advanced in sort of English and social studies, or math, history type of classes. When it came to math, I was, like I said, that was not my strength. I was so grateful that it was still a time period where I was in the math class for the kids like me. Right? I was in a math class where I felt pretty comfortable raising my hand, asking a question. I wasn't alone. Chances are somebody else had a similar question. The teacher kind of knew that this was a group of people who needed her to go a little more slowly. We were learning the same material, just at a slower pace than the kids in the more advanced class. We knew who the kids were in the advanced class, and we knew who we were. And it wasn't like this giant source of pain. I was glad. Conversely, we knew who the kids in honors English were and honors social studies. And I was very glad there was such a thing, because if I'd had to be in the English class going at the pace of the kids who were maybe, not so good at English, I think I would have been miserable. So the assumption on both sides that the kid who's advanced is going to be just fine. They'll figure it out. They'll go at their pace some other time. And the kid who's slower would rather be in the room with the fast kids is an assumption. They're projecting all kinds of feelings onto these children that I don't think anybody's ever bothered to find out if they exist. I just don't know many kids who are like, oh yeah, I want to be the dumbest kid in the class. No, why would you? And I don't mean dumb in a pejorative way. I'm just saying, I want to need to go the slowest. No, we know who we are.
Yeah, I've seen, like, some of these education papers, they talk about this term social loafing. So if you're in a class with a bunch of high achievers, then you're not, going to be motivated, or it'll just be very easy to use what they're doing. And
Well,
so
especially when they put you in group work.
Exactly. And so
it's demotivating when you're working individually, but if they put you in group work, the temptation to let the smart person do all the work and you just coast on their coattails is very high, and they're doing a lot of group work.
Right. No, absolutely. Okay, and so again, in the state standards, they endorse the notion that all students who are ready for rigorous high school mathematics in 8th grade should take such courses, Algebra 1. and all middle schools should offer this opportunity to their students. So this is, again, different than this framework. This framework recommends that all students take the same courses in kindergarten through grade 8. And now again, in the standards, mathematical concepts are likely omitted when trying to squeeze 2 years of material into one. This is to be avoided. But now in the framework, what they do, if you want to get to calculus, you have to combine algebra 2 and pre-calculus into 1 year. So you do this very thing that the standards are telling you not to do. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about acceleration. So acceleration, here's a quote: "In spite of many educators' lack of familiarity with research on acceleration, it is one of the most thoroughly researched instructional practices. It is so much so that there's so many studies that you actually have what is called a meta-analysis, so a study of all the studies." And oops, something's happening here. So a conclusion from these studies, it says that out of 380 studies, almost all forms of acceleration result in growth in achievement. Acceleration is far more effective in raising student achievement than most successful school reform models. When advanced students are presented with curriculum developed for age peers, they can become bored and unhappy and get turned off from learning. Accelerated students are more likely than non-accelerants to aspire to advanced educational degrees. And there are no issues with social emotional effects from acceleration. So in spite of this vast data set that shows this, so what is the framework then using to guide against acceleration? And this is especially a problem because in 10th grade, you can have students that are up to, 4 grade levels plus apart. And if you're putting them all in the same class, it becomes very difficult for a teacher to support all the needs of those students.
Oh, God. Oh, suddenly I'm getting spam bot attacked. It happens.
Oh, is that what's happening to the slides?
Yeah, I deleted them, but it happens every so often. Sorry.
Wow. Okay. That's okay. So we'll go on.
Yeah, it's fine.
Oh, okay.
I just had to block them.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So, what does the framework then do to justify this philosophy, one size fits all, also called heterogeneous classes? And so, first, what it does is it points out that the U.S. is 32nd in the world in mathematics for this PISA test. So this is a very scary and a very important point. But then it says mathematics in the highest achieving countries is typically taught in heterogeneous classrooms prior to 10th grade. Now, one thing to see here, prior to 10th grade, the framework's guiding prior to 11th grade, but I guess in their mind, what's one more year of being slowed down? Right. Okay, so then there's a lot of studies looking, and we can look at what is done in Japan, which is the test that scored highest on the PISA test. And so when you do this, you see quotes like, "Rather than slowing down the curriculum or directing struggling students to alternative programs of instruction, like low-track classrooms, students are encouraged to put in the extra effort to keep up." And so, that type of language, there's none of that in the framework for sure. Japanese high school students who take all of the courses offered will likely know more mathematics than US students do when they graduate college. US 8th graders are being taught at a 7th grade level in comparison to many of their international counterparts. So what you deduce from this is Japanese students are actually dealing with an accelerated curriculum relative to US students. So here's a quote from Brian Conrad. And what he says is, "The differences between the US K through 12 system and those of many countries in terms of teacher training and resources and salaries, national curricula and societal structure are so vast that it is not responsible to set statewide education policy based on such comparisons as the framework does. One can try to see what aspects of other countries' success may be emulated within the California system, but to appeal to what is achieved elsewhere while being silent about what the huge differences in the educational systems are is to deny the relevance of reality." And so he's just pointing out that just how unrealistic and how misrepresented the framework is doing with quoting this type of thing without actually giving a full detail of it.
Now,
And
I'm sorry, I wanted to ask something that it's been described, the framework has been described as having like a low floor and a high ceiling. Is that correct? Like as far
They
as a
right. They certainly do say that as of these tasks. Yes. And I mean,
r
just to say my response to that is, well, for the kids, why should they only get the high ceiling sometimes? Why not let those kids who want the high ceiling give it to them all the time? But go
right.
ahead with what you wanted to say.
Well, I was just gonna say it just seems like, I think they think it's a selling point. Like we're gonna keep the ceiling high, but we're just gonna lower the floor so that kids have more access, right? But then they also say they're having heterogeneous classes where there's a lot of discovery and inquiry learning as opposed to direct instruction. And so, I mean, it just seems to me like you're once again going to have a situation where the only kids in the class will be able to do any high ceiling work are the ones who have had some kind of outside help, right? Because you're not going to get to it that often in a heterogeneous class. Otherwise, you're going to be way ahead of the kids who don't get it. And they're going to feel even worse, or they're going to fall farther behind, or you're going to deprive the kids who are capable of it more and they'll go get it somewhere else. And then when you do throw it in, just randomly, here's a high ceiling problem. The only kids who are going to be able to do it are the ones who've had extra help. So you're not really, it's like you're just not really covering it. I think they're so adamant about being against ability tracking that they're trying to like throw everything into the mix into one heterogeneous class and say, look, we covered it. And human beings don't work like that. It's just not how things work in real life.
Right. And what's really important also is what data do they have to even indicate that that is a better way of doing things? And
Exactly.
they do not have data. And that's part of the point of this frustration with how they're misrepresenting things. There is no data that shows that this is better for students.
Right. Exactly.
And so here's another example then of how they use to justify these heterogeneous classes. They quote a study by Burris, and they which did use heterogeneous classes, and they say the researchers found that students who learned in heterogeneous classes took more advanced math, enjoyed math more, and passed the state regents test in New York a year earlier than students in traditional tracks. So I mean, here we go. That sounds great, right? But then you look at the paper, and what this study did was what it gave the accelerated curriculum to all the students. So including putting algebra in 8th grade for all the students, which is completely opposite to what the framework is doing, which is decelerating all the students. And so the point here, placing all kids in the same class and giving them accelerated instruction is completely different than placing all kids in the same class and giving them decelerated instruction, as the framework does. These are not at all the same things, completely different classroom environments and classroom dynamics. And the point is, the success of one does not at all imply the success of the other. And that's
Right.
what the framework is doing to justify what they're doing, but it's just not even valid whatsoever.
Mhm.
This issue with the misrepresentation of citations is actually a very significant problem with this framework. And so there's two studies here that I'm referencing which go into great detail on this. I already mentioned the Brian Conrad work, and there's also, if you go to savemath.net, there's an excellent write-up of numerous studies where to show how they're misrepresenting the research. And a point is that the framework misrepresents the very studies it's using to justify itself. And so added to this concern is the concern that the framework heavily references one author. So the framework cites one author 83 times, and it turns out to be one of the authors of the framework. And to put this in perspective, the next author is cited 13 times, and this is also an author of the framework. So remember, we had that study, the meta study, with the meta analysis, there were 380 papers, right? So
Mhm.
here we're just studying one or two authors, and they're the ones that write the framework. And so here, Brian Conrad's point, the framework never discusses inconsistencies in the math education literature. That is irresponsible when citing papers as a basis for public policy, because then it becomes difficult to distinguish evidence-based guidance from ideology. And so
Right.
this is a very, very important point, because one would hope if you're changing education of 6 million kids, it's going to be evidence-based and not ideology. And so this characteristic of misrepresenting literature, it was a huge problem in the first draft, and it continues to be a problem in this next draft. And it appears that these authors, they really don't care, because once they realize this becomes public policy, then at that point, whether it was evidence-based or not becomes irrelevant. And once this framework passes, they're going to have political justification, which means do this because the framework says so. So no longer will they go and try to figure out whether it was right or wrong. And now you have districts that are going to receive funding because they're perhaps following and adopting the framework. And so, it's a very dangerous situation that will unfold once this happens. And again, the bottom line, there is no data that says that for a kid who is prepared and motivated to take Algebra 1 in 8th grade, that holding them back would be beneficial. Okay, and then, so now with respect to this misrepresentation of data, it's very important to look at San Francisco Unified School District, because this district actually is considered the model for the framework. And so what they like to brag about in San Francisco is that they delayed any students taking advanced classes in mathematics till after 10th grade and moved the algebra course from 8th to 9th grade. And then they claimed the results. They claimed they saw a decline in the Algebra 1 repeat rate from 40 to 8%. And they claimed that they saw an increase in enrollment in advanced classes beyond Algebra 2. So this group of families in San Francisco who, they're very upset with the district, and they knew that these results were very marginal. So they did public records requests, and they found out that this repeat rate, what happened was they actually just removed a test. So it's not at all comparing the same thing. You have just a completely different thing going on. And then with respect to this increase in advanced classes, what they found the district was doing was defining a compression class called Algebra 2 Pre-Calc as an advanced class when the UC said it wasn't. And so it just was not an advanced class when they took this out. In fact, the enrollment in advanced classes went down. And then a third thing, the state assessment test results, and go to savemath.net to see this in more detail, the overall performance in this district actually went down. And then, so San Francisco was touted in the first draft of the framework, and then all this stuff came out, and so it actually got removed. But it's still the case, though, that this illusion that this worked in San Francisco still lives on through all the publications that occurred about it, because they didn't retract these claims in these publications. They're still out there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what I find very powerful, then, we have an example of what life would be like in a district that adopts this framework, and that answer is San Francisco, because they did this very thing. And so what happens is, obviously, parents aren't just going to accept this, that their students aren't going to get to calculus in this type of thing by delaying algebra to 9th grade. So they're going to put up a fight and try to figure out how they can get their students there. And this ends up being such a huge issue that there's actually a website in San Francisco describing how to do this. And this website was created by students for students and parents. And I would say another name for this website is How to Get Educated in a School District That Does Not Educate You. So here's a snapshot from this website. So it says, Navigating Math in San Francisco Public School, a guide to getting to calculus in the high schools. Are you interested in a STEM career? And so what it's saying here is, use this website to figure out how to avoid stress and how you can get to calculus for your students. Okay, so then what they describe on this website, so the first most popular option is to take algebra outside of the public school system. So this costs $700 plus the cost of a proctored exam. So this is an added burden, not just on students, but on parents, and not just cost, but time. And so this is what most students have to do in that district. So other options involve taking classes out of order or to compress them. And again, this is just adding obstacles and disadvantages, especially students with less resources. And remember that other districts just simply will not have to do this. Now, here are the 5 pathways that are available to students. So the first is you take algebra outside of the public school system. That's the topmost. The second one is, well, you just don't get to calculus. The third one is you compress algebra 2 and pre-calculus into one class. And the fourth one is you double up. You take algebra 1 and geometry at the same time. And then the fifth one, you take geometry and algebra 2 at the same time. So this ends up causing all kinds of problems for these students. And I have some quotes here from the website, which I just want to summarize because it's really important to see what parents and students will have to deal with if this type of framework were to be adopted. One thing, if you double up, even if it means that students had to give up classes that they were interested in, and also that there weren't enough spots for everybody when students double up. Another thing is the students find out too late that they were supposed to take Algebra 1 outside of the public school system because the district isn't advertising this, like saying to seventh graders, hey, if you want calculus in 12th grade, you better take this online class, right? That's not probably part of what they're doing. So then you have this issue, students go to school, and then in addition to that, well, you have to take this extensive class outside of school. So it can be quite overwhelming. And then you have these compression classes, and the problem with that is it skips over concepts. And also the problem with that is there just simply aren't enough spots for students who want to double up, as the priority is for freshman geometry enrollment goes to those who already completed Algebra 1. And perhaps the reason for this is that district actually realizes the law, the Math Placement Act, that they can't force students who took Algebra 1 to have to retake it again. But so now, and you have other districts who just other schools who didn't allow this double up options. And then it talks about how kids struggle who in these double up options because they're part of one of the class that they're taking simultaneously. The other class assumes that these students are completely done with that class in the homework. So it's a big effort. And then we also have that there's just simply not room in the schedule for the other electives that these kids would really like to take. Mm-hmm. And this final quote I found really interesting because it talks about, so the kid says, I took the Apex online class in 8th grade. I started in October, finished in April. Sometimes I would skip weeks, and other times, such as during the winter break, they got through a lot of units. And so when I hear this, I just think, well, hey, happy holidays from your district. Here you're spending your holiday season taking a class that the district should have offered. And it just, I just think it's really sad to hear these testimonials of what this is. I mean, this is what it's like, what these kids have to deal with. And so a big point, though, is these extracurricular activities, it's not, it's significant because it affects your college applications. They're competitive, and colleges look for this types of things. And, not just to mention the happiness, right, and the social emotional well-being of these kids. So these kids are disadvantaged for that particular reason, that they had to give up on those types of things. And so another really important point is, so whenever you see data about San Francisco, if they claim, good things or whatever, just be aware that there's a lot of education occurring outside of the school that's causing these results. And it's like the school's taking credit for what's happening outside of the school. And I think that's terrible. Like, so for example, even in spite of this, there was a 13% decline in the number of students who took AP calculus. And it would be a really interesting data point. How much of those students actually had education outside of the public school system? Because, that data is not taken, but it should be. It's very, very important.
Right.
And you can analyze this data. And then, so the bottom line is, what parents and what students would want to have to deal with this. But in spite of this is what the framework is guiding for California.
It's unbelievable.
Okay, so you had this other podcast a few podcasts ago, the derailing impact of content standards. And there's a quote from the paper that you went over. The creation of a mathematics pathway and set of courses that brought all students together in the same classes attract the opposition that many would expect. This came primarily from parents and currently accelerated students. Groups of parents organized meetings and Facebook groups to oppose the district changes, but the district stood firm, and within a year they saw substantial benefit. So basically what you see here is the district's just saying, screw you to the parents. And then they're saying that they have these substantial benefits. Well, and as discussed in your podcast and also shown on the state math site, data indicate that the stateside district is in fact San Francisco. So then if that's the case, these substantial benefits, which now they quote in the paper, is that this this 40% reduction of the students that failed went down to 8. Well, this was because they took a test away. So this is misrepresented at San Francisco. And then they say, well, these positive results are similar to those of other districts. This Burris paper, but again, the Burris paper was acceleration for all. So that again is very misleading. And then finally, they have this point about the proportion of students taking advanced classes at Gateside increased. But again, if this is San Francisco, what the families for San Francisco showed is that this was misleading as well. But all this stuff is still in this paper. You know, so if you read this paper, you don't know that this happened. And then the bottom line, the end result of all this is this school board that said, screw you to the parents, well, they're all recalled now, and overwhelmingly. And so now you have this point, the framework is guiding, let's do what San Francisco did for all of California.
No, thanks.
Yes. Instead, you know, here's this suggestion. Why not find out what districts that were successful did? You know, interview them, find out what they did, put that in the framework, and do that instead.
Right. Exactly.
Okay,
it seems so obvious. It seems so obvious that I think it's why people like me jump all the way to who's benefiting from them not doing it. Like, you can't believe that a Stanford professor, for example, like Joe Bowler, who's one of the main writers of it, you can't believe that she would not think of that herself, or not, or come up with a good reason to reject that was student centered. So then you start thinking, okay, is there a conflict of interest? Is it what's in it for her and what's in it for, you know, whether it's financial, political, ideological, like what is it? And that's why it has nothing to do with people who oppose it themselves being political. Because I've seen that criticism, like, well, you just don't like it because reasons. And it's like, no, the question is, there are good ways to do this. As you've pointed out here, there are good ways to take a look after 7 years at how we can improve math education in California, but they weren't even tried. So now we're left with no other option but to look at the other possible reasons. And when they're jumping out in our face, when you have little scenarios that include very obvious ideological language or the word equity all over the place, or, you know, things where there's so much hostility towards something like pathways or ability tracking, and, you know, such an all or nothing, one size fits all approach, what else are people supposed to think but that there's an ideological grounding for it, or that there's money changing hands somewhere, right? We're filling in gaps because it doesn't make sense.
Right. And I this point about what other vested interests are, it's not something I could address.
No, I mean, I can't either. I'm just saying this is why people ask. What I want to say is, go look at Twitter and go look at some of these other sites that are talking about this, because it does become very scary what's actually going on with respect to that. Right. It just makes the question pop up. And I think you really that, plus when you look at the research that doesn't add up, the self-referential style and the op-ed selling it, and then now there's stories of her emailing people to get in with the governor and kind of, you know, like, hey, can you put, and you just start to think, oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? And maybe we need a timeout. Like, maybe we just don't do this, because there are too many things, too many unanswered questions that don't add up to the best interests of the students of California.
Definitely. Yes.
Yeah. So,
okay. Now this next slide, this is something I really don't like to have to point out, but it's just that this is the reality of what's going on. And a point is that these people creating this framework, these are appointed. California has long been a state dominated by the Democratic Party. Now, this does not at all mean that all Democratic politicians are in favor of this framework. But, you know, the question is, who is speaking out against it? So it does turn out, as far as I know of one open letter by Young Kim, member of Congress, who wrote opposition to this. And so they were part of their letter, imposing a one-size-fits-all model on the students of California will instead stifle creativity, free thinking, and innovation. And so when I see this letter, you go look at who signed it, and it turns out to be signed by 11 members of Congress, but they all ended up being Republican. And so where are the Democratic leaders that are speaking out against this? And if they're just going to sit idly by enabling this to pass, then this now becomes political because this is tacit compliance. They're now aware of all these issues that you just stated, these misrepresentation of citations, and this thing is passing through. But so it's hard to believe that the education of our kids is becoming political, but the reality is that it has. And now, does the Democratic Party really want this framework as as its legacy? And they really better think long and hard about what they're doing with this, because we're seeing education is playing a larger and larger role in elections across the country. And so now you have in California these parents that they're Democratic and they may believe in the social policies the Democratic Party stands for, but if they have to decide between those and math education for their kids, which one are they going to choose? And that's a very difficult decision. It's not at all obvious which way that they'll go. Right. And just to finish this, the question is, these politicians that are enabling this, where are they sending their kids and grandkids? Probably not, right? Not to a district that's going to hinder their STEM careers. And
or they could be in Cupertino or Beverly Hills, right? Or even, what was the other one? Was it Irvine?
Irvine, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are some districts that are going to reject this. They're going to keep doing what they're doing, which is doing something better than this. And like I said, that 7 years from now, I wish I could believe that people would blame the framework or, the people at the Board of Education or the politicians that made this all happen. And I'm just seeing too much evidence that like with Common Core, right? Instead of saying, well, that didn't work, that was a bad idea. We need to implement more of the same kind of standard. I don't see the education establishment ever taking responsibility when they do these massive reforms like this. I don't see them taking responsibility for it failing. And the other thing that's missing is any degree of rigor in terms of, looking at the potential negative unintended consequences. That has been on the critics. So Save Math, for example, or many of the people who signed the open letter, you'll look in and they'll bring up all kinds of potential, things that you can reliably predict based on past evidence. So it's not even just a guess. It's like, we have evidence, we have data that this is a bad idea. You brought some up in this presentation about what happens when the kids don't take calculus and so what they miss out on. And it's all there to look at. And it doesn't even seem like they even looked at it. It was like, nope, we're over here. We're not looking at that. And that's unconscionable. That's not evidence-based.
It truly is. But I'd say, that's the importance of you doing your podcast, because now these things are documented and we have Brian Conrad's write-ups and we have what's on the Save Math site. So this is all written up. So as things get worse and worse and worse, people are going to look at that stuff and say, hey, you were warned about that and you ignored it. What the heck? Why did that happen?
Exactly.
Okay, so there have been numerous publications pointing out the issues with this framework, including 3 open letters. And I wanted to just briefly mention this one here because it's covered by 1,700 and counting STEM professionals. And so they say, students should be offered multiple pathways, take those classes at varying grade levels of middle and high school when they are ready so that they acquire the tools to explore other STEM options and avoid irresponsible compression late in high school. Now, what I want to really point out about this letter is who these signers are. So I've just gone through, I just selected some. So we have 7 Nobel Prize winners on this that have signed this document. And these top 4 names, Scott Aronson, Dan Bone, Henry Cohn, Terrence Tao, these are very significant names in the STEM field. And it's sort of like if you had an open letter about how to coach basketball, and it was signed by, say, Michael Jordan, Steph Curry, Larry Bird, and LeBron James, and they were telling you, hey, you're not coaching basketball correctly. Would you listen? And that's really what is happening here. These are big names that are telling the people the framework that they're really messing up with what they're doing. Okay, and here is the final data set that I wanted to cover, and it turns out to be a very important data set because it's what the framework is using to justify what it's doing, and it's kind of what you were referring to earlier. It's looking at 800,000 students who took calculus in high school and the effect it had on what they did in college. Okay, so the first group, 150,000 of these students earned college credit through the AP test, and they used it to pass through some of the calculus in college. So as we spoke before, this is great for these kids, huge for these kids. It could be career enabling, and this is 1 in 5 kids, and it could be as high as 1 in 4, as stated in the framework. And so this is great. Now, as opposed, so what the framework says about this is, well, what these students are doing is inequitable. So they're just going to throw these students under the bus.
How dare they
Oh,
achieve?
exactly. It is shocking about how the words they use to describe these pathways. Now,
I'm so glad they exist. I don't know how to do that stuff. And I want to live in a society where people who know how to do that stuff because that makes my life better. So I don't feel insecure. I don't feel unequal. And even if they go on to make way more money than I do, that's not guaranteed. First of all, not everybody who does really well in calculus ends up being a multimillionaire, but we need those people. You don't punish that level of excellence if you want to remain living in civilization. That's crazy.
Absolutely. And especially, you look at what other countries are doing right now in the US, very important for the US to be competitive in this global environment. Okay, and so now you have the second group. So 150,000 retake Calculus 1 and earn an A or a B. Now, this is great because college calculus course is a hard course. We know it can be a step up in rigor from what they took in high school. It's enabling their STEM career. And so if there's a pathway towards receiving an A or a B in a college calculus course, which involves exposing them to it in high school, well, take advantage of it and do it. However, what the framework says is, well, these people, they're just retaking calculus. So the calculus they took in high school was just a waste of their time, in spite of the fact that there was this data set which shows that their grades are measurably higher because they did this. So a third group of people, 150,000, take other math courses that are more pertinent to their major or career interest. And really, there is really nothing wrong with this here. Not all students will want a STEM career. And it's likely the calculus they took in high school would help them in whatever they did. And plus, they might return to it later on at some point in their life. And so having this would help them. So I don't see anything wrong with this. Now, the next group, 100,000, retake Calculus 1, earn a C or lower. So there's definitely some concern here, right? Because they're still not getting these higher grades. But a thing to understand is, first, a C is passing. It's a chance to move on and improve. And to remember, students, when they're first year away from home in college, they're dealing with all kinds of stress associated with it. And so if their high school calculus class enabled them to pass this college calculus class, then this was a good thing for them. But there's definitely issues in this group that need addressing. Now, this third group, 250,000, they say need or choose to take actually a lower math class than calculus. So this is definitely a concern. But a point here is this difference between need or choose, because a lot of students do this to lighten workload. They might want to focus on their other major. They may want to boost their GPA. And so, it's really unclear with what fraction of this group is doing it for whatever reason. So, but there is definitely a concern here that needs addressing. But looking at this data, I think you could argue that most of these students were well served by taking calculus in high school. But what happens with the makers of the framework, what they conclude is, instead of trying to figure out these groups that it could have helped, they could have served better, what they're concluding is take this away from everybody. And so that's why I have here on the bottom, what teenagers say these days. It's like, wait, what? How did you get that from this? And right. It's frustrating because you hear this type of thing. Oh, people aren't well served by taking calculus in high school. Well, here's the data they're referring to. So you decide for yourself. You're looking at the same data they are. What is the answer?
as a parent, and again, not a STEM professional, not a mathematician, just a parent, I look at this and I say, okay, well, I would want to know, what can we do in elementary school to better prepare the kids, or in middle, okay? What can we do to teach math to better prepare them for calculus so that a greater percentage of them get above a C? Okay, I think back to my grandparents' time period when it was pretty much required. It wasn't like, if you went to high school, you took math all the way through. You did it wasn't really like optional that you would go through calculus. Okay, you would need to do that just like you would need Latin and Greek. Okay? And it wasn't like, "Oh, I can't." They just taught the math at the younger grades differently. And so my question will be, well, what are we doing in the early grades? Because so much of this and all the discussion of the pathways and everything is focused from 8th grade forward. And then they want to go 9th grade forward. And I'm like, what happened to K through 5? Those years
Mhm.
are essential. If you don't build that foundation rock solid of those core skills, which is more of the rote learning stuff, but pre-conceptual stuff, okay? If that's not rock solid, the kids always playing catch up. Always play. Of course, they're not ready for algebra in 8th grade. Of course, they're not ready for calculus by 12th grade. Never mind AP calculus. And so when I look at this data, that's what I ask. What's going on in elementary school? And that's not to say they should all be getting A's and B's in calculus. I'm just looking at, the mostly the 250,000 who might have to, do something over again. That to me is a symptom that something's not going right in elementary and middle school.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it comes to this point of let's look at what these successful districts are doing. And I spoke with a teacher who's at a district with really poor proficiency, one with actually like 15% proficiency in math. And what he told me was what happens there is they focus all their effort on the other aspects of school, especially like language learning and
Right.
issues like that. And then very little time actually gets devoted to math. And so then all of a
Exactly.
sudden you're sort of surprised, well, why is math proficiency so low when hardly any time is devoted to it? And so I'm not an educator. I can't go in and even start to make these types of comparisons, but that's what things like that I would really look at, emphasize that more somehow. And, look at these other districts. How are they doing it? Maybe
Mhm.
somehow math needs to be brought in more into emphasize more through the curriculum.
The fact that that wasn't done, and that instead they looked at this, they looked at San Francisco and then they twisted it and did it wrong. I don't know. I keep coming to the word unconscionable. It's either so negligent, right? Or there's some kind of mendaciousness. Like, what is it? I can't believe that these people, these extremely smart people, just oopsied it.
Right.
I can't believe, I don't believe that.
Okay, so I'm just about to conclude here, and I someone told me I need to create a comic to try to demonstrate some of the things I'm talking about, and so now here I'm using my great artistic ability. Right, I'm being completely sarcastic, but I'm trying to show here how the foundation of math as a student goes up through their courses, and the how important it is to develop this foundation. So on the left we have this foundation built on the learning all the math standards. And so you have a student climbing up the staircase. They get to the top and they're really happy. They have their AP calculus. The door to the STEM career is open. And their first year of calculus, they're able to place out and they're able to continue on to through the ladder onto a STEM career. So then on the right, you have a district that adopts the framework where standards that you have in yellow, the standards that the students just didn't wonder about. And then in pink, you have the standards that they were just avoided coverage of. And so now you have that is a staircase that's built upon a very weak foundation. So the student gets to the top, the foundation is not strong enough, and then it doesn't support them. They're not ready for the STEM career. They fall off and they fall down and they find out they just simply were not prepared. And what can they do now? And that the State Board of Education misled them. and the State Board of Education told them that this was best. So
Well, if
I
they,
just had,
yeah, that's great. But if they even conclude that it was the SBE, I mean, what other narrative are they being given when they fall down that it's, it's some other political, all the terms that they use. I think you've been very generous, David, in terms of the ones they weren't curious about. And for those watching or wondering what he means by the standards they weren't curious about or the ones they didn't cover, in the framework, they talk about the students discovering and being curious about math and investigating things. And one of the questions that people have had is, what if they're not curious? It's like you kind of have to know a thing exists to even be curious about it, right? You have to be introduced to it to be curious about it. These aren't things that are just like floating around in the air. And so I think you've been actually quite generous there as far as how many they will be curious about or that will be covered. But nevertheless, that's quite good as far as depicting what's going to happen.
it's something.
I love it. Great job.
Okay. So here we're coming to the end now, and here's just a summary. So the framework is guiding for basically universal deceleration in math. This guidance conflicts with what other districts currently do for their high achieving students, conflicts to what is guided for in the state standards, and is in fact in opposition to the directives of the Math Placement Act. And so the framework authors, as we discussed, they really should study what districts that are doing that have been successful, probably try to do what they did, and
Right.
try to point to a solution based on that. But since they're not doing that, this framework is going to fail people. The best solution at this point is that we have to reject this framework and go back to the 2013 framework. The framework states equity influences all aspects of this document. So instead of presenting ways of guiding to get more SED kids into these advanced pathways, what the framework is guiding for is to remove these pathways for everybody, which, just completely baffling. But it is as if their solution to issues of equity could be interpreted as, if kids are not enabled to excel, then no kids excel. And if no kids excel, then all kids are equal. And so problem solved, you have equity. And
Yep.
as we've been discussing throughout, this is in the end is just not a terrible solution. Is a terrible solution. In their quest for equity, the framework has lost sight of the consequences of removing these pathways for students and ends up failing the very group that it's claiming to help, because they don't have the power to mandate this. That it can only be guidance. So many districts will just simply not adopt this, as well as other private schools, countries, and states. And so this framework will systemically disadvantage kids in districts that adopt it, meaning there's a system in place which will prevent these kids from high achievement. And so basically this framework could not be more inequitable than it is.
Yep. Totally agree. And this is a really good point from Just an Average Man. The failure to ensure proficiency in math during high school leads to incredible amounts of people dropping out of or not being able to progress through college. That's another data point that we actually know. we can look at that. And then he says these so smart kids are the new oppressors. And that's what worries me, is that those districts are going to keep doing what they're doing, and in 7 years' time, or possibly sooner, there's going to be discussion of how it's inequity and it's not fair and et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is, no, it's not fair. I mean, it's objectively not fair today, but the people who are making it this way are the ones claiming to care about fixing it. They're the ones saying they want to help, but they're not helping. And that's what bothers me is, they get to, kind of wear the mantle of virtue by saying their intention is X, but they're actually doing Y.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, and then here he says something else. Not a teacher, but in California elementary, I see the math being taught as a system, not to get the correct answers, but instead how to eliminate 3 wrong answers to get and pass the star. Do you have any thoughts on that?
You do hear about things of this nature going on, but it is, to be honest, not being a teacher, it is very hard for me to comment on this type of thing. But yes, it is disconcerting where, as you said, if your kid is in 5th grade and comes home with homework and you're like, wow, I don't even understand it. What is this supposed to be showing? Then
Yeah.
yeah, that's a concern.
Right. Well, thank you so much, David. This was just so incredibly helpful and informative. I hope that everybody will share this broadcast if you know people in California, but also just with everybody. This applies all over. I've seen frameworks in New Jersey, Virginia, even North Carolina that are doing similar things. Some of them have already adopted math curricula that has a similar mindset about calculus. They don't really need it, or they're calling it the push to calculus or whatever. So it's not just California, but California is just very big. And as David mentioned, if they write textbooks to go with a framework like this, then other states might feel like pushed into doing it because they don't want to commission a whole separate textbook. That's one of the reasons it matters so much what California does. And some schools still do, especially high school, they still do use texts. Now, as far as Save Math, we've talked about the savemath.net website on this show. I want to shout out a couple of things. If you can possibly volunteer to help with the effort to get the word out about this to more people in California, even if you're not in California, the effort needs volunteers. So please go to the savemath.net. It's literally savemath.net, and sign up to be volunteer. That we need writers. We need there's just people can do different things to help get the word out, because a lot of people don't know this is going on. Still, believe it or not, they don't know. And then I want to once again throw up the banner for the comment, the public comment. This 16th is the last day, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we're coming up against it. You do not need to be in California to make public comment. If what we've just presented to you seems as absurd to you as it does to us, please make a comment. We don't know what effect it's going to have, but we just know that we need to get our voice. They asked for public comment. Let's do it. So please get this out, and if you can volunteer, that would be great as well. Visit savemath.net just to read more about the framework. I think there's a lot of great information, especially there's a new page, as David pointed out, on the research not adding up. I put the link in the chat, and that will explain to you more in depth about how the research is just not really what I would call research. So anyway, anything else you want to say in parting, David?
I think, yeah, we covered it. And I really appreciate being on your show, Deb.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming, because I could never in a million years. Adrian, we tried to cover that one paper that you mentioned, and it was still a little over my head. I think what you've done is make it accessible to most parents. And that's all I try to do here, is to educate parents about what's going on, because the education press is not doing the most awesome job of that. So thank you so much. Thanks to everybody. The replay of this will be up immediately. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and have a great afternoon.